Chapter 8. It's my own invention. After a while, the noise seemed gradually to die away, till all was dead silent, and Alice lifted up her head in some alarm. There was no one to be seen, and her first thought was that she must have been dreaming about the lion and the unicorn, and those queer Allen Saxon messengers. However, there was a great dish still lying on her feet, on which she had tried to cut the plum cake. So I wasn't dreaming after all, she said to herself, unless we're all a part of the same dream. Oh, I do hope it's my dream and not the Red King's. I don't like belonging to another person's dream, she went on in a rather complaining tone. I've a great mind to go on and wake him and see what happens. Excuse me. At this moment, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud shouting of, "Ahoy! Ahoy! Check!" And a knight dressed in crimson armor came galloping down upon her, brandishing a great club. Just as he reached her, the horse stopped suddenly. "You're my prisoner!" the knight cried as he tumbled off his horse. Startled as she was, Alice was more frightened for him than herself at the moment, and watched him with some anxiety as he mounted again. As soon as he was comfortably in the saddle, he began once more, "You're my—" But here another voice broke in, "Ahoy, ahoy, check!" And Alice looked around with some surprise for the new enemy. This time the White Knight. He drew up at Alice's side and tumbled off his horse, just as the Red Knight had done. Then he got on one again, and the two knights sat and looked at each other for some time without speaking. Alice looked from one to the other in some bewilderment. "She's my prisoner, you know," the Red Knight said at last. "Yes, but then I came and rescued her," the White Knight replied. "Well, we must fight for her then," said the Red Knight as he took up his helmet, which hung from the saddle and was something the shape of a horse's head, and put it on. "You will observe the rules of battle, of course," the White Knight remarked, putting on his helmet. "I always do," said the Red Knight, and they began banging away each other with such fury that Alice got behind a tree to be out of the way of the blows. I wonder now what the rules of battle are," she said to herself as she watched the fight, timidly peeking out from her hiding place. "One rule seems to be that if one knight hits the other, he knocks him off the horse, and if he misses, he tumbles off himself. And another rule seems to be that they hold their clubs with their arms, as if they were Punch and Judy. What a noise they make when they tumble, just like a whole set of fire irons falling into the fender. And how quiet their horses are. They let them get on and off them just as if they were tables." Another rule of battle that Alice had not noticed seemed to be that they always fell on their heads, and the battle ended with their both falling off again, side by side. When they got up again, they shook hands, and then The Red Knight mounted and galloped off. "It was a glorious victory, wasn't it?" said the knight as he came up panting. "I don't know," Alice said doubtfully. "I don't want to be anybody's prisoner. I want to be a queen." "So you will, when you've crossed the next brook," said the White Knight. "I'll see you safe to the end of the wood, and then I must go back, you know. That's the end of my move." "Thank you very much," said Alice. "May I help you off with your helmet?" It was evidently more than he could manage by himself. However, she managed to shake him out of it at last. "Now one can breathe more easily," said the knight, putting back his shaggy hair with both hands, and turning his gentle face and large, mild eyes to Alice. She thought she had never seen such a strange-looking soldier in all her life. He was dressed in tin armor, which seemed to fit him very badly, and he had a queer shaped little deer box fastened across his shoulders, upside down, and with the lid hanging open. Alice looked at it with great curiosity. I see you're admiring my little box," the knight said in a friendly tone. "It's my own invention to keep clothes and sandwiches in. You see, I carry it upside down so that the rain can't get in." "But the things can get out," Alice gently remarked. "Do you know the lid's open?" I didn't know it," the knight said, a shade of vexation passing over his face. Then all the things must have fallen out, and the box is no use without them." He unfastened as he spoke and was just going to throw it into the bushes when a sudden thought seemed to strike him, and he hung it carefully on a tree. "Can you guess why I did that?" he said to Alice. Alice shook her head. "In hopes some bees may make a nest in it. Then I should get the honey." But you've got a beehive or something like one fastened to your saddle," said Alice. "Yes, it's a very good beehive," the knight said in discontented tone. "One of the best, but not a single bee has come near it yet. And the other thing is a mousetrap. I suppose the mice keep the bees out, or the bees keep the mice out. I don't know which." "I was wondering what the mousetrap was for," said Alice. "It isn't very likely there would be any mice on the horse's back." "It isn't very likely there would be any mice on the horse's back." "Not very likely, perhaps," said the knight. "But if they do come, I don't choose to have them running all around." "You see," he went on after a pause, "it's as well to be provided for everything. That's the reason the horse was all those anklets around his feet. "But what are they for?" Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity. "To guard against the bites of sharks," the knight replied. "It's an invention of my own. And now help me on. I'll go with you to the end of the wood. What's that dish for?" "It's meant for plum cake," said Alice. "We'd better take it with us," the knight said. "It'll come in handy if we find any plum cake. Help me to get it into this bag." This took a very long time to manage, though Alice held the bag open very carefully because the knight was so very awkward in putting in the dish. The first 2 or 3 times he tried, he fell in himself instead. "It's rather a tight fit, you see," he said, as they got it in at last. "There are so many candlesticks in the bag." And he hung it to the saddle, which was already loaded with bunches of carrots and fire irons, and many other things. "I hope you've got your hair well fastened on," he continued as they set off. "Only in the usual way," Alice said, smiling. "That's hardly enough. You see, the wind is so very strong here. It's strong as soup." "Have you invented a plan for keeping the hair from being blown off?" Alice inquired. "Not yet," said the knight, "but I've got a plan for keeping it from falling off." "I should like to hear it very much." "First you take an upright stick," said the knight. "Then you make your hair creep up on it, like a fruit tree. Now the reason hair falls off is because it hangs down. Things never fall upwards. You know, it's a plan of my own invention. You may try it if you like." It didn't sound a comfortable plan, Alice thought. For a few minutes, she walked on in silence, puzzling over the idea, and every now and then stooping to help the poor knight, who certainly was not a good rider. Whenever the horse stopped, which it did very often, he fell off in front, and whenever it went on again, which it generally did rather suddenly, he fell off behind. Otherwise, he kept on pretty well, except that he had a habit of now and then falling off sideways. And as he generally did this on the side on which Alice was walking, she soon found that it was the best plan not to walk quite close to the horse. "I'm afraid you've not had much practice in riding," she ventured to say as she was helping him up from his fifth tumble. The knight looked very much surprised and a little offended at this remark. "What makes you say that?" he asked as he scrambled back on the saddle, keeping hold of Alice's hair with one hand to save himself from falling over on the other side. "Because people don't fall off quite so often when they've had much practice." "I've had plenty of practice," the knight said, very gravely. "Plenty of practice." Alice could think of nothing better to say than, "Indeed." But she said it heartily as she could. They went on a little way in silence after this. The knight, with his eyes shut, muttered to himself, and Alice watched anxiously for the next stumble. "The great art of riding," the knight suddenly began in a loud voice, waving his right arm as he spoke, "is to keep—" Here the sentence ended as suddenly as it had began, and the king fell heavily on the top of his head, exactly in the path where Alice was walking. She was quite frightened this time, and said in an anxious tone as she picked him up, "I hope no bones are broken." "None to speak of," the knight said, as if he didn't mind breaking 2 or 3 of them. "The great art of riding, as I was saying, is to keep your balance properly. Like this, you know." He let go of the bridle and stretching out both his arms to show Alice what he meant, and this time he fell flat on his back, right under the horse's feet. "Plenty of practice," he went on repeating all the time that Alice was getting him on his feet. "Plenty of practice." "It's too ridiculous," cried Alice, losing all of the patience. "You ought to have a wooden horse on wheels, that you ought." "Does that kind go smoothly?" the knight asked in a tone of interest, clasping his hands around the horse's neck as he spoke, just in time to save himself from tumbling off again. "Much more smoothly than a live horse," Alice said with a little scream of laughter, in spite of all he could do to prevent it. "I'll get one," the king said thoughtfully to himself. "Or 1 or 2 or several." There was a short sentence after this, and then the knight went on. "I'm a great hand at inventing things. Now, I dare say you noticed the last time you picked me up that I was looking rather thoughtful. You were a little grave," said Alice. "Well, just then I was inventing a new way of getting over a gate. Would you like to hear it?" "Very much indeed," Alice said politely. I'll tell you how I came to think of it," said the knight. "You see, I said to myself, the only difficulty is with the feet. The head is high enough already. Now first I put my head on the top of the gate. Then the head's high enough. Then I stand on my head. When the feet are high enough, you see, then I'm over, you see. I suppose you'd be over when that was done," Alice said thoughtfully. "But don't you think it would be rather hard?" "I haven't tried it yet," the knight said gravely, "so I can't tell for certain. But I'm afraid it would be a little hard." He looked so vexed at the idea that Alice changed the subject hastily. "What a curious helmet you've got," she said cheerfully. "Is that your invention too?" The knight looked down proudly at his helmet, which hung from the saddle. "Yes, but I've invented a better one than that, like a sugar loaf. When I used to wear it, if I fell off the horse, it always touched the ground directly. So I had a very little way to fall. You see, but there was a danger of falling into it, to be sure. That happened to me once. The worst of it was, before I could get out again, the other white knight came and put it on. He thought it was his own helmet." The knight looked so solemn about it that Alice did not dare to laugh. I'm afraid you must have hurt him," she said in a trembling voice, "being on top of his head." I had to kick him, of course, the king said.